Jews, we understand that the Torah is written by humanity, written over the course of hundreds of years and redacted over time. It is a compilation of hundreds of years of storytelling. And for many of us who accept this reality, we look at Torah from a different lens, a different perspective. We can see the beauty of Torah not found in a literal understanding, but in the meaning behind the text. What makes it holy is not about who wrote it, but what it represents, what it symbolizes. Torah is a symbol of our tradition. It is holy because it reminds us that as humans we all struggle with our identity. We all wrestle with meaning, and ultimately we each need to work out for ourselves what impact Torah will have in our lives. This is why keeping kosher and observing Shabbat rules are choices for us and not the law. Because Jewish law is based on the fact that Torah is the Word of God written by the hand of Moses. As Reformed Jews, we are liberated from such a belief, and I do not have to spend the next few minutes trying to convince you that we all need to follow the Torah exactly, or we go to hell. Yes, traditional Judaism believes in hell, but we're not going to talk about that. So we do not dismiss what we don't like about it. We are to, the Divrei Torah, engage in its words. And this particular Torah portion has much for us to engage in, if not struggle with. The main characters of the Akedah, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, we have discussed over the years, trying to understand the Akedah through each of their perspectives. And out of all the characters of the story, who is the most troubling? For today's purposes, we'll just say Isaac. We are taught traditionally that the Akedah is the quintessential story of faith. Our ancestors recognize that we all struggle for faith and meaning. The Akedah is a story that gives us a sense that we are not in control, but rather we are all pawns of the Holy One. For many of us, this is not a comfortable arrangement. We all know that ultimately we control our actions and how we choose to respond. What makes Isaac's reaction in the story so frustrating is that it does not seem real. Isaac just allows life to happen to him. And in most of our life experiences, we do not react that way. How many Jews do you know would behave this way? Sure, take me on a 3-day hike without telling me where we're going. Can you imagine not knowing what to pack? Sure, I'll lie on the altar. You know what, while you're at it, feel free to bind me, but bind me really good. The rabbis wrote Midrashim to try to make sense out of this. And Midrashim, just to remind you, are stories the rabbis write often to make a point or to fill in the gaps that the Torah may seem to have. Sometimes the Midrashim give a different perspective on the same story, trying to help us see the story from a different light. In this case, the rabbis are struggling with Isaac's reaction. So they write a version that interweaves direct quotes from Genesis chapter 22 and elsewhere as they see fit. In this part of the Midrash, it gives Isaac some control in the situation. From Bereshit Rabbah we read, when Abraham was about to begin the sacrifice, Isaac said, "Father, bind my hands and my feet, for the urge to live is so willful that when I see the knife coming at me, I may flinch involuntarily, causing the knife to cut improperly, and thus disqualify myself as an offering. So I beg you, bind me in such a way that no blemish will befall me." So Abraham bound his son well. Then Isaac said to Abraham, "Father, don't tell mother about this while she is standing over a pit or on a rooftop, for she might throw herself down and be killed." Look, the rabbis had other concerns back then. But the rabbis write Midrashim because the storyline in the book of Genesis does not pass their sanity test. Because the idea of asking someone to just lie down and take it feels wrong. That is why we as Jews and Israel as a country cannot just lie down, be bound, and sacrifice. Been there, done that. There are many in the world that wish we Jews, Israel specifically, would just lie down, be bound, and go away. But we are blessed to live in a time when the state of Israel is strong, resolved, and understands its rightful place in our world. It is not monolithic. No Jewish view can be. Really, as we are a people who believe in debate, and even more debate. So too, the state of Israel is wrestling with many issues. as it tries to evaluate every decision and action that it does. So hearing tons of criticism and rhetoric from those that do not have the entire picture is very frustrating. As we hear phrases like war crimes, disproportionate response, collective punishment, targeting civilians. Throughout Operation Protective Edge, these terms have been launched at Israel with the same intensity and frequency as Hamas's rockets. Arab government spokesmen constantly refer to Israel's actions as aggression. In extreme cases, Israel is accused of genocide and ethnic cleansing. When politicians, pundits, or the public misuse these terms, one can only think of a quote from The Princess Bride. "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." One of the common accusations directed at Israel is that its war with Hamas in Gaza constitutes aggression. In fact, it seems to be a knee-jerk reaction to make such an accusation whenever Israel undertakes any military action. We all have heard such comments in this country, and not just by non-Jews either. There are plenty of Jews who are misinformed and have no problem spreading this misinformation. And when we hear terms like war of aggression, what does that really mean? There is no clear or universally accepted definition of a war of aggression. In the General Assembly Resolution 3314 and the 2010 amendments on the ICC statute indicate that aggression is the use of armed force by a state against another state in any manner inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations. In other words, it is the unprovoked initiation of unlawful offensive force unmotivated by considerations of or justified by any form of necessary and lawful self-defense. The lawfulness of these actions must be approached contextually. Professor Lung-Chu Chen of New York Law School states that a developing process of coercion may reach a point where a victim state must immediately and proportionately respond militarily to protect itself or its citizens. He continues, law cannot reasonably ask and expect a target state to wait like a sitting duck to see its own destruction in the face of such danger. The reality is that Israel was provoked into launching Protective Edge by continued rocket and mortar fire from Gaza into southern Israel, from which Hamas, as the ruling government in Gaza, is ultimately responsible. How long would it take any American to demand action from our government if missiles flew from one of our bordering countries? Remember 9/11 and how we demanded retribution with an unknown target? Protective Edge grew out of the prior Operation Brother's Keeper, launched in the West Bank after Hamas operatives from Hebron kidnapped 3 Israeli teenagers. Hamas initially denied responsibility, although they eventually admitted it, and refused to return the teens, as we know. Instead, they launched 230 rockets into Israel between July 2nd and July 7th. The cycle of escalation led to the launching of Protective Edge on July 8th. Additionally, for some time, Israel possessed intelligence that Hamas had built a large offensive tunnel network leading into Israel, having discovered 3 of them in 2013. Little do we know. Repeatedly, Israel resorted to diplomatic means to achieve the reasonable goal of Protective Edge, ending the increasing threat that Hamas poses to Israel's security and the lives of its citizens. Israel agreed and adhered to multiple humanitarian ceasefires, but Hamas repeatedly violated them, entering them in bad faith and only as a ruse. Hamas stated consistently that it did not agree to a permanent ceasefire unless its demands were fully met. These demands were namely lifting Israel's legal blockade and opening all crossings for passage. Reports at the time indicated that Israel agreed to many of these demands, but Hamas also demanded the reopening of Gaza's airport and seaport, which we know serves as an entry point for Iranian weapons, a demand it knows Israel can never accept. Hamas's bad faith negotiations and constant refusal to disarm left Israel with no choice but to take military action, if Israel wanted to protect the lives and property of its citizens. In terms of proportionality, the bottom line legally is that when a country goes to war, it is allowed to use as much force as is necessary to stop the threat that caused it to go to war to begin with, and does not have to limit itself to the same means or level of intensity used by the enemy. While necessity determines the situations allowing a state to use some form of armed force, proportionality determines the breadth of that permissible force. The intensity of a state's response is governed by the magnitude of the threat posed to it by the enemy that attacked it, and not of the individual attacks it suffered. So the measuring stick of proportionality can't be the tit-for-tat analysis of death tolls popularly presented in the media, as those of us that read the nightly news can attest to. Israel's not obligated to employ only the lightest means at its disposal against Hamas, whose military might is, of course, much less than Israel's. Nations go to war to end an armed threat posed by another side, and not simply to revert to the status quo, where they were still under the other side's threat. This absurd result is not demanded by international law, which allows states to win their wars, and by definition, wars are only won by applying more force than the enemy can muster. Proportionality permits Israel to pursue every Hamas warehouse, weapons storage facility, and military leader anywhere in Gaza Strip until it eliminates the threat Hamas poses. Hamas itself claims its rockets can now reach any point in Israel and have been fired as far north as Haifa, posing a very real threat to an ever-expanding number of Israel's citizens. Hamas's offensive threat is compounded by the reach and magnitude of their tunnel infrastructure leading into Israel. Their effective strikes via tunnel infiltrations have led to serious IDF casualties. Many of the tunnels led into civilian areas, some with openings right under kibbutz dining halls. And we have learned from security sources that Hamas intended to use these tunnels in a mass casualty attack against Israeli citizens on Rosh Hashanah. Today could have been a very different day if Israel did not defend itself. Hamas has promised to rebuild the destroyed tunnels after the IDF's withdrawal, and are expected by analysts to reconstruct it at an accelerated pace. Past experience shows that they should be taken seriously. Hamas exploits periods of quiet to improve its tactics, weapons, and methods, and left to its own devices, it will continue to do so. The ever-improving quality of Hamas's rocket arsenal makes their threat more ominous. Realizing Israel's vulnerability, Hamas can now be expected to continue firing rockets towards Ben Gurion Airport, virtually halting tourism and disastrously affecting business travel and investment, leading to Israel's international and economic isolation. International law's abuse as a political weapon ties Israel's hands and gives Hamas the needed cover and impunity to target Ben Gurion with no fear of Israeli reprisals. Against Hamas's very real and ever-growing threat, proportionality permits Israel to deploy the means necessary to eliminate the threat permanently. Since Israel's air and artillery strikes were unable to end the threat of Hamas's rockets, arsenal, or tunnels, Israel's military commanders determined that a ground invasion was the only means to set the organization back to a point where it could no longer threaten Israel. Israel's ground invasion was within the bounds of proportionality, since it was necessary to permanently remove the threat posed by the terrorist organization, even if the means employed outweigh anything that Hamas can muster or has so far used. We also hear in the media Israel has been targeting civilians. On the face of things, since the IDF has attacked homes, schools, hospitals, and UN premises, and civilians have died as a result of its strikes, it would appear that Israel is not distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate targets. Distinction, one of the most important principles for an army to observe, is codified in Articles 48, 51, and 52 of the Geneva Conventions, Additional Protocol 1, which state that warring parties cannot target or intentionally harm civilians or civilian objects. However, active combatants and military objects are targetable at all places and at all times. And reports from Gaza-based journalists have repeatedly indicated that Hamas officials were seen using hospitals as headquarters, and that rockets were being stored in mosques and fired from residential neighborhoods and schoolyards. Not only that, but Hamas members have also admitted to converting civilian buildings for military use. Hamas militants captured during fighting in Gaza admitted their organization used mosques for military activity, and that their tunnels have been built near kindergartens and clinics. Israel's Shin Bet has documented interrogations with multiple captured terrorists who have made these admissions. Israel's critics say the bare fact of civilian harm conclusively proves its criminality. They reason that a high number of civilian casualties automatically means that war crimes have been committed. Jimmy Carter used these numbers to demand an investigation into Israel's actions. Quote, "There is never an excuse for deliberate attacks on civilians in conflict. These are war crimes. 3 Israeli civilians have been killed by Palestinian rockets, while an overwhelming majority of the 1,600 Palestinians killed have been civilians." Unquote. For the sake of accuracy, it must be stated that according to an analysis by the BBC, it is still unclear how many of the dead in Gaza are civilians and how many are fighters. Since the focus so far has been on reporting the casualties and not a detailed analysis of their composition. Drawing conclusions based on the wrong numbers of casualties is still premature, though a study by the New York Times has indicated that the age and gender group most overrepresented in the casualty list are those most likely to be terrorists. Regardless of Israel's right to defend itself, it still is obligated to take reasonable measures to minimize civilian casualties. And none of us want civilian casualties. That is not what we are about. We want the Palestinians to be free of Hamas. The IDF has various methods of letting the parties have effective advance warning before launching an attack that may affect civilians. One method is knocking on the roof, firing a non-lethal projectile at a building's roof, giving occupants a reasonable amount of time to evacuate before the actual strike. And before knocking on the roof, the IDF calls residents to warn them of the incoming projectile. The UN has stated that during Protective Edge, in most of the cases where Israeli Air Force strikes resulted in civilian casualties, the IDF called to warn occupants to flee. The Air Force has also adopted the practice of dropping leaflets on targeted areas prior to strikes, warning civilian residents to flee in advance of an imminent strike. Admittedly, Israel's obligations don't end with early warnings. The attacking party must take all reasonable precautions to protect civilians in the course of an attack, and to call off or suspend attacks if the civilian collateral damage would be excessive. Article 58 of the Geneva Convention's Additional Protocol 1 obligates parties to protect civilians against the collateral effects of an attack. Thus, the IDF readily acknowledges that a legal review is carried out before each strike is undertaken. Before strikes, the Air Force sends out an unarmed plane from the Camel Squadron to determine whether the strike should be carried out or aborted because of the civilian presence. Even after that determination, gun cameras routinely show pilots breaking off engagements after determining that the strike would cause a disproportionate loss of civilian life, even after using its warning methods. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to make such a determination without the benefit of hindsight. I appreciate the comments by Justice Minister Tzipi Livni as she expressed, "A peace agreement is not some left-wing prattle. A peace arrangement will moderate partners is an element of the security approach of the State of Israel. Settlements are not security, they are security consumers. And anyone who prefers an isolated settlement over a peace arrangement using security as an excuse causes damage to future generations," unquote. She also stated that without peace talks, we can't create such an alliance between Israel and Arab states under threat from ISIS. Peace talks would help us fight terrorism that is threatening everyone. Those who don't want to solve this conflict are the ones who will lead us in the end to a bloody battle with beheaders, unquote. Like Isaac, Israel is underestimated. Like Isaac, Israel is seen through very black and white lenses. Like Isaac, Israel is bound on the altar awaiting the final solution. But this time, unlike Isaac, Israel gets up from the altar, casting away that which binds it, and stands tall, reminding all of us that we will not stand idly by when another wants us destroyed. We will not bow to political peer pressure. We will not let another Holocaust take place. We will never forget the lessons of history, and we will defend ourselves at There's a midrash on the Al-Qidah that reminds us of the true humanity of the situation. Abraham is about to use a knife on his son, and his eyes tear up. And in a beautiful moment, his tears go into Isaac's tears as they intermingle. Midrash goes on to describe, and he placed him on the altar. Abraham's eyes were directed at Isaac's, and Isaac's at the heaven of heavens. Tears were flowing from Abraham's eyes until his entire body was all but afloat in them. This moment, imagining the father weeping and the son weeping as well, their tears become one pool of sadness, to describe so beautifully the heartache that we as human beings can feel. And when it comes to tears, heartache, and pain, it does seem that we as a people have to endure a lot. Not that others do not have to. It just seems like it can be unrelenting. Israel is invested in peace. It is not about intent, but true investment. Israel has been invested in peace for its entire existence. Israel gave up the Sinai for peace with Egypt in the 70s. Israel in the 90s made peace with Jordan, and they continue to have normal relations today. In 2000, Israel offered 97% of the disputed territories to the Palestinians and the full recognition of a Palestinian state in return for two conditions, just two conditions: public recognition of the Jewish state and Israel's right to exist. The Palestinians refused, and the violence against Israel escalated. There has been not a single Israeli living in Gaza since 2005. And Israel agreed to cede control of Gaza to the Palestinians. But instead of embracing peace with her neighbor, Hamas declared war by shelling Israeli towns nearly non-stop. And in the midst of that, Israel has continued to bring in supplies, treating Palestinians and Syrians at Israeli hospitals. The fact that Israel has peace with Egypt and Jordan also proves Israel's true intention, and that it is invested in peace. For decades, Israel has proven through peace agreement after peace agreement its intentions. Now, it's up to Hamas and the Palestinian leadership to embrace mutual recognition and join Israel in choosing peace. Israel represents and protects in the Middle East diversity, human rights, political freedom. In fact, Arabs have greater human rights in Israel than in every other Arab country, particularly in how women, religious minorities, and homosexuals are treated. These are universal values that people of conscience can't ignore and won't abandon. So too, we need to remember that in Israel, 1/5 of their own citizens are Arabs. Whatever Jews do in Israel, Arabs do as well. Nowhere in the region do Arabs, Christian or Muslim, have the rights and freedoms that are everyday life in Israel. We also have to remember that Hamas's charter on killing Jews and how they teach their children through television shows that glorify killing Jews to want to be terrorists. We have seen over and over that Israel uses rockets to protect children. Hamas uses children to protect its rockets. Over and over again, year after year, Israel has asked simply for recognition and the right to exist. In return, they've offered virtually all of the disputed territories in full recognition of a Palestinian state. Both sides need to reject violence, embrace the rule of law, and mutual recognition. For now is the time for dialogue. For the path to peace is paved with hope and cooperation, not fear and aggression. Don't we all deserve better? Is mutual recognition too much to ask for? Can you imagine a Middle East with mutual recognition and respect? The double standard and mishigas that Israel has to endure, no other country would put up with. And yet we all hold Israel to a high standard. I personally am very proud of Israel and how Israelis have handled this situation. But it's hard to understand. One of my favorite quotes on this issue comes from one of our greatest leaders and visionaries, the late and great Golda Meir. One of the first duly elected women prime ministers on earth said, "We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. We will only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us." This is the bottom line. We want shalom. But what should be the expectation on Israel if Hamas continues its current ways of operating? And where are we, the Jewish American community? We must be supporting our spiritual homeland in any way we can. That is the bottom line. For Israel will not be bound on the altar to be sacrificed